The air in Elias Vance's penthouse was thick with the metallic tang of dried blood and the cloying sweetness of expensive potpourri, a bizarre cocktail that assaulted my senses the moment I stepped past the uniformed patrol officer. The initial sweep had been done, the bright yellow tape a stark contrast against the polished black granite of the entryway. My name is UserYJ, and for the past 15 years, I've been sifting through the wreckage of lives, searching for the whispers of truth hidden in the dust and fibers. This scene, however, felt different. UserYJ, the detective greeted, his voice a low rumble that barely carried over the hum of the building's ventilation system. He gestured vaguely towards the sprawling living area, where the body of Elias Vance, the visionary tech CEO, lay like a discarded puppet. Looks like a pretty clear cut, unfortunately. Vance found by his personal assistant this morning. Door forced. Valuables missing. Robbery gone wrong, maybe a disgruntled former employee with a grudge. I nodded, not taking my eyes off the scene. Vance's penthouse was less a home and more a monument to excess. Floor-ceiling windows offered a dizzying panorama of the city, now muted by the early morning haze. A custom-built grand piano sat unplayed in one corner, its polished surface reflecting the flashing strobes of the crime scene lights. Artworks, clearly originals, adorned every wall, each piece screaming a price tag most people couldn't earn in a lifetime. And in the center of it all, Elias Vance. He lay sprawled on a plush, cream-colored rug, his dark suit jacket askew, revealing a blood-soaked dress shirt. A single, ragged wound marred the left side of his chest. His eyes, wide and unseeing, stared up at the vaulted ceiling. The official cause of death would be confirmed later, but from where I stood, it was obvious. A fatal stab wound. The weapon was nowhere in sight, which wasn't unusual in a robbery. But something tugged at me, a tiny snag in the fabric of the detective's neat narrative. I knelt, donning my latex gloves, the crisp snap echoing in the cavernous room. The detective watched, arms crossed, a veteran's patience etched on his face. He'd seen enough of these to think he knew the drill. I had too, but I'd also seen enough to know that the obvious was often a well-crafted illusion. A gaze swept over Vance's body. No defensive wounds on his hands or arms, which was odd for a struggle. His expensive watch was still on his wrist, a limited-edition timepiece that would fetch a small fortune. A gold signet ring gleamed on his finger. If this was a robbery, why leave those? I filed that observation away, a little pebble in my shoe. I moved methodically, my eyes trained for the microscopic. The area around the body was disturbed, but not violently so. A few overturned vases, shattered ceramic shards glinting under the lights, suggested a struggle, but the sheer volume of high-end electronics, the large-screen TVs, the sound system, all remained untouched. Even a solid gold statue of a charging bull, easily liftable by two people, remained on its pedestal near the fireplace. A robber wouldn't just ignore that. Any signs of forced entry at the main door? I asked, my voice low. Yeah. The lock on the service entrance down the hall was jimmied. The patrol officer chimed in, pointing to a door I hadn't yet approached. Seems like they came in through there, standard stuff. I nodded slowly, still examining the main living area. Standard stuff, maybe. But the main entrance, the one with the biometric scanner and reinforced steel, was pristine. Why use the service entrance, then go through the trouble of staging a struggle in the main living area? Leaving the most obvious high-value items, it felt like a performance. My eyes narrowed, focusing on Vance's feet. His designer loafers were scuffed, but not with the kind of grit one would expect from a forced entry and a frantic struggle. They had a curious, almost uniform coating of what looked like fine, pale dust. I made a mental note to sample it later. Then I saw it. It wasn't glinting like glass or metal. It was dull, organic-looking. I carefully nudged the rug with the toe of my boot, exposing it fully. A single, withered flower petal, not the kind of flower I'd find in the sleek, minimalist arrangements Vance favored. This was something wilder, something out of place. I carefully picked it up with tweezers, dropping it into a sterile evidence bag. The detective glanced over. Find something? Possibly, I replied, my gaze sweeping the room again, searching for other anomalies. The air, despite the lingering scents, felt unnaturally still, almost staged. The chaos was too contained, too artistic. I moved towards the grand piano, running a gloved hand along its polished surface. No obvious fingerprints, the surface wiped clean, but just above the keyboard, barely visible, was a faint smudge. Not a print, but a residue, I carefully collected a swab. The team from the central lab is swamped, the detective informed me, rubbing the back of his neck. With the morgue at capacity after mass casualty event, everything's backed up. We're going to have to rely heavily on your on-site work, UserYJ. Get as much as you can here before we move him. I grunted in acknowledgement. It was true. The city was still reeling, resources stretched thin. It meant more pressure, more responsibility, but also more freedom to follow my instincts without the usual bureaucratic bottlenecks. I circled Vance's body again, this time focusing on his clothing. The fabric of his suit was expensive, finely woven. A faint, almost imperceptible sheen caught my eye on his left lapel. I leaned closer, pulling out my magnifying glass. It was a single iridescent scale, not fish, not reptile. It was too delicate, too ethereal. It reminded me of a moth's wing, or perhaps something even more exotic. I carefully collected it. The detective was still talking on his comms, relaying information to headquarters. I ignored him, my mind already piecing together the disparate elements. The untouched valuables, the specific entry point, the lack of defensive wounds, the pristine piano, the strange dust, the withered petal, the iridescent scale. Each one a tiny dissonant note in the detective's simple melody of a botched robbery. This wasn't a robbery. This was something else entirely. And I had a gut feeling that Elias Vance wasn't just a victim. He was a carefully selected piece in a much larger, more intricate game. My job was to figure out who was playing and why. The tension in the room wasn't just from the crime. It was from the sudden realization that the official story was a flimsy curtain, and behind it, something truly dangerous was waiting. I felt a prickle of unease, a familiar sensation that always accompanied the unraveling of a carefully constructed lie. This was going to be a long one. The air in the morgue at capacity after mass casualty event was thick, a cloying blend of disinfectant and something metallic I couldn't quite place, probably the sheer volume of everything. The usual quiet hum of refrigeration units was now a low thrumming cacophony, punctuated by the hurried footsteps of technicians and the muted clatter of instruments. It was a place designed for solemn stillness, but today it vibrated with a grim, relentless energy. Vance's body lay on a stainless steel gurney, stark under the harsh fluorescent lights. My initial examination at the scene had been brief, the city still too chaotic to allow for a full, unhurried process. Now with him here, isolated in a corner of the overwhelmed facility, I could truly begin. I pulled on a fresh pair of nitrile gloves, the material snapping tight against my skin, and picked up where I'd left off, circling his clothing. His tailored suit jacket, a deep charcoal wool, showed no obvious signs of struggle, no tears, no scuffs, nothing to suggest a violent grappling. That was the first whisper of an anomaly. A man like Vance, a tech titan, wouldn't go down without a fight, not in his own penthouse. Yet his expensive fabric was pristine, save for the single devastating entry point. I leaned closer, my magnifying loupe pressed to my eye, scanning the lapels, the cuffs. Then I saw it, tucked almost imperceptibly into the weave of the left cuff, a single, pale blue fiber. It was impossibly fine, almost translucent, unlike anything I'd expect from Vance's own wardrobe or the typical urban environment. I carefully retrieved it with a pair of fine-tipped forceps, dropping it into a sterile evidence bag. A small thing, easily overlooked, but my gut already knew it wasn't random. Anything interesting, UserYJ? I straightened, turning to face the detective, who stood a few feet away, arms crossed, his gaze tired. He was a good man but pragmatic, always looking for the clearest path. Just starting, I replied, gesturing vaguely towards Vance. The clothing is remarkably intact for a close-quarters incident. He grunted. Yeah, well, sometimes they just don't see it coming, or they're paralyzed by fear. I know how it is. He paused, then added, we've got a witness statement coming in later today. A cleaner apparently found him, might shed some light. A cleaner, my mind filed that away. We'll see, I said, turning back to Vance, dismissing the detective's assumptions with a quiet resolve. My job wasn't to confirm theories, but to find facts. I moved on to Vance's hands. No defensive wounds, nothing under the fingernails to suggest he'd scratched an assailant. His manicured nails were clean, almost unnervingly so. But on the pad of his right index finger, a faint, almost invisible residue. It had a crystalline sheen, not quite dust, not quite powder. I gently scraped a sample into another bag. It was too specific, too uniform to be general grime. Then the wound itself. A single, precise shot to the chest, just above the heart. The entry point was clean, almost surgical. There was no excessive tearing of fabric, no wide spatter pattern radiating outwards that would suggest a struggle or a flailing arm disrupting the shot. It was a tight, controlled impact. The lack of blood on his pristine shirt collar and upper chest, despite the fatal wound, felt off. It suggested he was either already incapacitated or completely surprised, shot point-blank without a chance to move. But even then, the neatness, the containment of the scene felt staged. I ran my gloved finger along the collarbone, then down his arm. No abrasions, no bruising. This wasn't a messy, desperate act. This was executed with chilling precision. My attention shifted to his personal effects. His expensive watch was still on his wrist, undamaged. His wallet was in his inner jacket pocket, cash and cards untouched. But it was his phone that truly caught my eye. It lay beside him on the gurney, retrieved from his trouser pocket, already bagged by a colleague before it reached me. It was an experimental model, not yet released to the public, sleek and impossibly thin. I powered it on, my breath held. Most victims of high-profile crimes had their devices wiped remotely or they were damaged in the struggle. This one, it booted up cleanly. The lock screen displayed a generic, abstract background. No personal photo. That was unusual for Vance, a man known for his flamboyant personality. I tried his birth date, then a few common sequences. Nothing. I looked at the call logs, scrolling through recent calls and messages, but it was locked. A colleague had noted it was locked with a fingerprint. "Can I access the fingerprint reader?" I asked the colleague, a quiet technician named Anya, who was cataloging other items nearby. She nodded, carefully manipulating the device, attempting to unlock it using Vance's thumb. After a few tries, it flashed, then remained locked. "His print won't work," she said, her brow furrowed. Vance's own fingerprint wouldn't unlock his phone? That didn't make sense. Unless the fingerprint registered wasn't his, or more unsettlingly, the phone had been re-registered to someone else's print after his death or perhaps moments before. It was a long shot, but the possibility pricked at me. I took the phone, running a quick diagnostic scan for recent activity. The last active application wasn't a messenger, or a stock tracker, or even a game. It was a secure communication app, one I recognized from high-level corporate security protocols, and it had been active mere minutes before the estimated time of death. What's more, the last message sent had been a single, encrypted string of characters. No context, no sender displayed, just a silent, outgoing burst of data. It was almost as if someone had used his phone, sent a message, then tried to lock him out of his own device. But why? I felt a prickle of unease crawl up my spine. The pristine suit, the specific fiber, the crystalline residue, the precise wound, the untouched wallet, and now the locked phone that wouldn't recognize its owner's print, and that single cryptic outgoing message. Individually, they were minor oddities. Together, they painted a picture that was anything but simple. This wasn't a random street robbery gone wrong. This wasn't even a passionate, messy murder. This was controlled, professional, and that meant the easy answers the detective was looking for were probably miles off the mark. I felt a familiar tension tighten in my chest. My instincts were screaming. This wasn't just a murder, it was a carefully constructed narrative, and I was holding the first few unsettling pages. The question was, who wrote it and why, and how far were they willing to go to keep the story from changing? That stopped me cold. Unless it was a long shot, but the alternative that a man who lived and breathed digital security would simply have a non-functional biometric lock felt even less likely. My gut, a loyal companion through years of evidence sifting, gave a sharp tug. Something was off, deeply off. Back in the lab, the fluorescent lights hummed with their usual sterile drone, a counterpoint to the controlled chaos that often reigned. Today, however, there was an undercurrent of genuine strain. The news channels, playing silently on a monitor in the corner, flashed updates about the ongoing response to the recent disaster. The local facility, the morgue at capacity after mass casualty event, was dominating every conversation, every resource allocation request. It meant delays, it meant overworked colleagues, and it meant a subtle but persistent hum of anxiety through the building. My own case, the murder of a tech CEO, felt like a footnote in the grand scheme of things, yet its quiet peculiarities nagged at me. I needed to focus. I pulled on my gloves, the thin latex a familiar second skin, and turned to the array of evidence laid out on my bench. First, the fibers. I'd collected them from Vance's bespoke suit jacket, a few stray threads from the office carpet, and a particularly interesting cluster from beneath his fingernail, almost invisible to the naked eye. Under the comparison microscope, the fibers from his suit and the carpet were exactly as expected: wool, silk, synthetic blends common in high-end office environments. But the ones from beneath his nail, they were different. I adjusted the focus, bringing the individual strands into sharp relief. These weren't natural fibers. They possessed an unusual sheen, almost metallic, and a distinct, irregular crimp pattern. Their color was a muted, almost dusty blue-gray, a shade I couldn't immediately place. They were too thin for upholstery, too coarse for standard clothing. My mind cycled through possibilities: industrial felts, specialized packaging. No, the weave was too fine, too deliberate. This material wasn't incidental. It was a deliberate composite, engineered for something specific. I logged the initial observations, flagging them for further spectral analysis. These fibers didn't belong in Vance's office or under his fingernails. They hinted at a struggle, yes, but with what or whom? Next, the phone. I'd carefully bagged it, ensuring no further contamination, and now it sat cradled in a forensic data extraction unit. Bypassing the security was a delicate dance, a cat-and-mouse game against the very best encryption, but the fingerprint issue was my primary target. I ran a diagnostic on the biometric sensor. It was fully functional. Then I accessed the registered prints. My breath hitched. There were two registered prints. One was partial, corrupted, almost certainly an attempt to overwrite or delete it. The other was pristine, and it definitely wasn't Vance's. A cold certainty settled in my stomach. Someone had registered their own fingerprint to Vance's phone. After his death, or perhaps moments before the fatal blow, to gain access. And then they tried to erase the evidence. But why? What was so critical on that phone that it necessitated such a risky maneuver? I initiated a full data dump, focusing on recent activity, deleted files, and any remote access logs. This wasn't a simple robbery gone wrong. This was calculated. As the data extraction progressed, a subtle scent caught my attention. It was faint, almost imperceptible over the usual lab odors, but distinct, a metallic sweetness, like burnt sugar and ozone. I'd noticed it on Vance's collar when I'd first examined the body, a fleeting impression I'd dismissed amidst the chaos of the crime scene. Now I scanned his personal effects again, running a quick surface test on his tie, his watch, and then his shirt collar. My portable chemical analyzer beeped, registering a hit, a peculiar chemical residue. I isolated a microsample from the collar for a more detailed examination under the mass spectrometer. The results were slow to materialize, the complex molecular structure baffling the initial library match. It wasn't a common household cleaner, not a perfume, not even a known industrial solvent. It was a synthetic polymer, a specific type of fluorinated compound, rarely encountered outside of highly specialized manufacturing processes, things like high-performance coatings, advanced lubricants for precision machinery, or even certain aerospace components. I leaned back, pulling off my gloves. The pieces were starting to coalesce, forming a picture that was far more intricate and unsettling than a simple murder. The unusual fibers, the tampered phone with a stranger's fingerprint, and now this exotic chemical residue. None of it pointed to a disgruntled employee or a business rival in a fit of rage. It screamed professional. My mind raced, trying to reconcile these disparate elements. Vance, a tech CEO, likely spent his days in glass towers and boardrooms. Why would he have obscure industrial fibers and a specialized fluorinated compound on him? Was he somewhere he shouldn't have been, or was someone trying to make it look that way? A tremor of doubt ran through me. Was I overthinking this? There was the pressure from the disaster response bleeding into my judgment, making me see conspiracies where there were only coincidences. No, my gut had been right too many times to ignore now. These weren't coincidences. These were deliberate anomalies. The initial suspects, the disgruntled board member, the rival CEO, felt flimsy now, like cardboard cutouts. This wasn't their style. This was precise, almost surgical. It meant whoever killed Vance wasn't just after his life. They were after something else, something they tried to hide, and in doing so, left behind a trail of calculated deception. And that meant the real killer or killers were still out there, far more dangerous than anyone had initially imagined. Unless it was a long shot, but the implications gnawed at me. My fingers hovered over the device, the cool glass an indifferent barrier. If the phone had been compromised, then whatever data it held would be suspect, a potential rabbit hole, or worse, a meticulously crafted lie. I spent another hour trying various forensic bypasses, but the phone's security was robust, as expected from a tech CEO. There was no easy way in, and I wasn't about to risk wiping data with a brute force method. I bagged it carefully, labeling it for a deeper dive with specialized equipment. This wasn't just a simple murder anymore, not if the victim's own phone was actively resisting his identity. The next morning, the air in the analysis lab felt charged, a frantic energy thrumming through the fluorescent lights. The lead detective, a man whose patience was as thin as his tie, strode in, a smirk playing on his lips. He tossed a clear evidence bag onto my workstation, the contents clattering. "UserYJ, looks like we got our guy," he announced, his voice booming. "Dumpster dive near Vance's office building. Burner phone, active too." Inside the bag was a cheap, plastic-cased smartphone, the kind I could pick up at any convenience store for cash. A quick glance at the screen showed a series of crude, threatening text messages. The sender ID was just a number, but the recipient was clearly Vance. The messages were vitriolic, accusing Vance of corporate theft, of ruining lives, of being a snake in the grass. One message, sent just hours before Vance's estimated time of death, read, "You'll pay for what you did. Tonight you pay." "We're cross-referencing the cell tower data now," the detective continued, already sounding like he was writing the arrest warrant in his head. "Looks like the phone was active in the vicinity of Vance's building at the time of the incident. We've got a preliminary ID on the numbers it called most often to, a known disgruntled former employee, a developer Vance fired 6 months ago for insubordination. He's got a history of online harassment." A colleague at the next bench looked up, nodding approvingly. "Sounds open and shut, boss. Motive, means, opportunity, even a confession practically." I picked up the bag, my fingers brushing against the cold plastic. It did sound open and shut. Too open, perhaps too neat. The messages were almost comically villainous, the timing impeccable. My internal alarm bells, usually a quiet chime, began to clang. Vance, a man who navigated the cutthroat world of tech, wouldn't have left such an obvious, direct threat unaddressed, or at least not been caught so easily by a burner phone. He was a man of layers, of calculated moves. This felt amateur. "I'll run the full forensic suite on it," I said, my voice carefully neutral. "Trace evidence, digital footprint, metadata, see if we can nail down the sender's identity beyond a shadow of a doubt." The detective waved a dismissive hand. "Don't waste too much time, UserYJ. We've got bigger fish to fry, and the brass wants this wrapped up. Just confirm the links, get us a solid report." He left, the tension in the room easing slightly, replaced by the low hum of equipment and the distant, almost constant wail of emergency sirens, a grim soundtrack to the city's current state. The pressure was immense. Everyone was overworked, stretched thin, desperate for a quick resolution to any case. I placed the burner phone under the microscope first, a habit. Even a cheap phone could tell a story. No obvious prints on the exterior, wiped clean, that was expected. But then a flicker. On the seam where the plastic casing met the screen, almost invisible to the naked eye, a few specks of glitter. Not the kind I'd find on a child's art project, but a fine, iridescent dust, almost metallic. Unusual. I carefully collected a sample. Next, the digital forensics. I mirrored the phone's data, then began to peel back the layers of its activity. The call logs and text messages were exactly as reported, pointing squarely at the disgruntled developer. But as I delved deeper into the metadata, things started to unravel. The timestamps on the sent messages were precisely aligned with the network tower data, too precise. Every message had been sent from a location perfectly within range of the towers, covering Vance's office and home at the exact moments of transmission. It was flawless. Real-world cell phone usage, especially from a burner, rarely created such a clean, uninterrupted digital trail. There were always dropped signals, slight delays, moments of drifting out of range. This looked simulated. I ran a deeper analysis on the phone's operating system, checking for anomalies in the firmware. And there it was. a subtle, almost undetectable modification. The phone's standard OS had been overlaid with a proprietary, highly sophisticated spoofing program. This wasn't an off-the-shelf app. This was custom-built, designed to perfectly mimic real network activity to create a ghost in the machine. It could generate fake call logs, fabricate text messages, and even simulate location data with unnerving accuracy. The entire trail, from the threatening texts to the perfect tower pings, had been manufactured. My breath hitched. This wasn't the work of a disgruntled developer. This was professional, highly professional. The glitter sample from the casing came back from preliminary analysis. It was a trace amount of a rare earth element compound, often used in specialized optical fibers and high-end circuit boards. Not something I'd find on a cheap burner phone or on the clothes of a common developer. It was the kind of material that might be handled in a state-of-the-art electronics fabrication lab, or perhaps a black market outfit dealing in cutting-edge, untraceable tech. I sat back, the sterile glow of the lab lights reflecting off the burner phone's now sinister screen. The convenient culprit was a meticulously crafted illusion. Someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to frame the developer to make this case look like a simple revenge killing, and in doing so, they'd left behind a far more dangerous breadcrumb. Corporate espionage, black market tech, perhaps even something more insidious. This wasn't just a distraction, it was a warning. The tension in the room, once external, now coiled tight in my gut. The morgue at capacity after mass casualty event was just down the hall, a constant grim reminder of the city's current state and the immense pressure bearing down on us all. The detective's departure had left a void, but it was quickly filled by the low hum of my equipment and the distant, almost constant wail of emergency sirens, a grim soundtrack that had become far too familiar. I took a slow, deliberate breath, pushing away the lingering scent of disinfectant and the weight of the previous conversation. Physical evidence was one thing. The digital world, Vance's digital world, was another beast entirely, and I needed to tackle it now. I walked back to my workstation, the chair cool against my legs as I settled in. On the pristine white surface, laid out with meticulous care, were the electronics recovered from Elias Vance's penthouse. A sleek, high-end smartphone, a tablet, and a slim laptop. Standard issue for a tech CEO, nothing immediately screamed secret life from their polished surfaces. But I knew better. The most mundane devices often held the most explosive secrets. My first step was always extraction. I connected Vance's phone to my forensic rig, initiating a full data dump. While that hummed along, a progress bar slowly creeping across the screen, I turned my attention to the laptop. It was a custom build, which was interesting. Most executives went for off-the-shelf security-hardened models. This suggested Vance either had specific needs or a healthy dose of paranoia. The login screen stared back at me, demanding a password. No surprise there. I spent the next hour working through common password patterns, then moving on to more advanced cracking techniques. It was a dance of algorithms and processing power, a test of patience. My fingers flew across the keyboard, commands scrolling rapidly in green text against a black background. The air conditioning in the lab hummed, a counterpoint to the whirring of the server rack behind me. Finally, a small chime echoed in the quiet room. Success! The laptop's desktop loaded, clean and minimalist. Standard applications, a few work-related folders. I started with a superficial sweep, looking for anything out of place. Email logs, browsing history, recently accessed documents. Everything seemed to fit the profile of a busy, successful CEO. Until it didn't. I found an unusually large, hidden partition on the hard drive, tucked away behind layers of decoy data. It wasn't just encrypted. It was obfuscated, designed to look like random system files. My eyebrows rose. This wasn't off-the-shelf security. This was bespoke, professional-grade concealment. Someone had gone to great lengths to hide this. This was my wait. That doesn't add up moment. Why would a CEO, even one with secrets, need this level of digital invisibility? Cracking this partition took considerably longer. I ran multiple decryption tools simultaneously, leveraging every ounce of the lab's computational power. The clock on the wall ticked past midnight, then 1, then 2. My eyes burned, but a strange energy coursed through me. I was close. I could feel it. At 3:17 a.m., the last layer of encryption yielded. A new set of folders appeared, not with the typical corporate naming conventions, but with cryptic alphanumeric sequences. I opened the first one. Inside were communication logs, but not from standard email or messaging apps. These were from a heavily modified, peer-to-peer encrypted network, almost certainly custom-built. The timestamps were recent, some from just days before Vance's death. I started sifting through the messages. They were coded using jargon that was clearly specific to a particular field. Keywords started to emerge: Project Chimera, neural net integration, ethical parameters, data acquisition targets. It wasn't about a rival corporation, not directly. It was something far more ambitious and far more unsettling. Project Chimera. The name itself sent a shiver down my spine. The communications hinted at an advanced AI initiative, one that seemed to be pushing boundaries, perhaps even ignoring them. There were discussions about unconventional data harvesting and predictive modeling with societal impact. The language was clinical, detached, but the implications were terrifying, and Vance was a central figure in these discussions, not just an observer. As I dug deeper, I found references to specific individuals, identified only by code names, but their roles were clear: lead architect, data specialist, ethics liaison, though the ethics part seemed to be more a formality than a genuine concern from the tone of the messages. There were also mentions of a secure, off-grid server farm, referred to only as the Foundry. My fingers paused over the keyboard. This wasn't a simple murder investigation anymore. This was a deep dive into something vast and potentially dangerous. Elias Vance wasn't just a tech CEO. He was entangled in a project that sounded like it could reshape society, or perhaps unravel it. The stakes had just skyrocketed. I scrolled through more files. There were schematics too, not for physical hardware, but for complex algorithmic structures. My knowledge of AI was broad, but these designs were cutting edge, pushing into areas I knew were controversial, even forbidden in some research circles. The ethical lines were not just blurred, they were actively being erased. Then I found a series of financial transactions, large sums of money routed through shell corporations, funding Project Chimera. The paper trail was convoluted, designed to obscure the true source, but I saw familiar patterns, echoes of previous cases where power and influence had tried to hide their tracks. One of the shell companies, Aegis Solutions, had a familiar name attached to its initial incorporation documents, a name I recognized from the periphery of high-level government contracts, a name associated with immense, almost unchecked power. My stomach tightened. I had just stumbled onto something that went far beyond a simple homicide. This wasn't just about who killed Elias Vance. It was about why and what he knew and what Project Chimera truly was. The implications were enormous. I felt a knot of dread twist in my gut. I was just a forensic analyst, good at finding facts, but this felt like walking into a labyrinth blindfolded, with every step taking me deeper into a den of lions. Was Vance killed because of Chimera, or was he a victim of its own machinations? I leaned back, rubbing my temples. Doubt gnawed at me. Was this just a side project, an ambitious venture that simply went too far? Or was it something truly nefarious, something that powerful people would kill to keep hidden? The evidence, however cryptic, pointed overwhelmingly to the latter. I was alone in the lab, surrounded by the hum of machines and the silent, damning testimony of Vance's digital life. The city outside was still, save for the distant sirens, but a storm was brewing in the digital realm, and I was now standing right in its path. I had to continue, had to know what Vance had truly been involved in. My fingers still hovered over the keyboard, the screen glowing with fragmented data logs and encrypted references to Project Chimera. Elias Vance, the prominent tech CEO, wasn't just a victim, he was a nexus, a central point in something far grander and far more unsettling than a simple corporate assassination. The stakes, I realized with a tightening knot in my stomach, had just skyrocketed from solving a murder to potentially exposing a sprawling network. And that kind of exposure tends to make powerful people very, very uncomfortable. The first sign that my investigation was becoming an inconvenience arrived with a summons to the senior manager's office. The room, usually a sterile testament to bureaucratic order, felt subtly different today, a touch too warm, the air too still. The senior manager, a man whose smile rarely reached his eyes, leaned back in his plush chair, hands steepled. UserYJ, he began, his voice smooth as polished stone. Excellent work on the Vance case. Your attention to detail, as always, is exemplary. I nodded, a prickle of unease starting at the base of my neck. Praise from him was often a precursor to a veiled request. We appreciate the thoroughness. Truly, he continued, a slight pause that stretched just a beat too long. However, given the sensitivities around Mr. Vance's public profile and the need to reassure the market, we need to bring this to a swift, definitive close. I understand, sir, I replied, choosing my words carefully, but there are still several avenues I'm pursuing. The digital footprint, for instance, points to a highly complex, almost invisible network, and the trace evidence from the initial scene has some peculiar anomalies I'm still cross-referencing. He waved a dismissive hand, a gesture that managed to be both casual and utterly final. Anomalies, networks. UserYJ, we're looking for a killer, a motive, not chasing ghosts in the machine. We have a solid suspect profile from the detectives team, disgruntled former associate, clear financial motive. Let's not overcomplicate things, shall we? The board wants a conclusion. I want a conclusion. His gaze sharpened, holding mine. The pressure is immense. Resources are stretched thin, especially with the current situation. He didn't elaborate, but I knew what he meant. The city was reeling, and our facilities were under strain. Let's focus on delivering a tidy, actionable report. By end of week, if you please. The unspoken message hung in the air. Stop digging. I left his office with a metallic taste in my mouth. Tidy and actionable were not words I associated with truth, especially not in a case like this. My resolve, instead of crumbling, hardened. If they wanted me to stop, it meant I was on the right track. My next stop was the morgue at capacity after mass casualty event. The air, usually chilled to a precise, antiseptic crispness, was now thick with the cloying scent of disinfectant struggling against something deeper, more visceral. Gurneys lined every available corridor, draped in white sheets. Attendants moved with a grim, practiced efficiency, their faces etched with exhaustion. The usual quiet hum of refrigeration units was drowned out by the muffled sounds of constant movement, hushed conversations, and the distant clatter of instruments. It was a place of overwhelming sorrow and unrelenting work, where the sheer volume of the deceased made meticulous, individual focus a challenge. I navigated the crowded aisles, past the temporary cold storage units humming louder than they should, until I reached the section where Vance's remains were being held for re-examination. My objective was to retrieve a specific, almost microscopic fiber I'd noted during the initial analysis, a synthetic polymer not typical of any clothing Vance or his known associates wore, nor present in the crime scene environment. I wanted a deeper spectroscopic analysis, a long shot, but something that had been nagging at me. Ah, yes, still here. But I won't get much more from him, UserYJ. We're barely keeping up with the new arrivals. He gestured vaguely at the overflowing corridor. He's been moved to secondary storage, took his clothes for final incineration this morning, standard procedure after primary analysis, especially with the backlog. My stomach dropped. Incineration, but I specifically flagged a few items for further review, including his blazer. There was a hold. He frowned, consulting a smudged clipboard. Hold was lifted yesterday. System said case concluded, evidence cleared for disposal. I saw the clearance myself. Sorry, UserYJ. Can't keep these things indefinitely, not with everything. His voice trailed off, his gaze drifting to the silent figures beneath the white sheets. My mind raced. A hold on evidence, lifted without my consent or knowledge. Case concluded. The senior manager's words echoed in my ears. This wasn't just pressure, this was sabotage. Someone was actively trying to erase my leads. Back in my lab, my fingers flew across the keyboard, accessing the secure server where all digital evidence for the Vance case was stored. I needed to verify something crucial: the integrity of the digital logs from Vance's personal server, specifically the ones detailing his communication with entities related to Project Chimera and the mysterious Blackwood references. I had archived a complete, verified copy of these logs myself, with checksums and timestamps. I pulled up the directory, my gaze scanning for the encrypted folder. It was there. A wave of relief washed over me, brief and fleeting. I clicked it open. The contents were different. The file names were identical, the dates matched, but but the file sizes were subtly smaller. I ran a quick integrity check, comparing the current files against the baseline checksums I generated days ago. The results flashed red. Multiple integrity failures. My breath hitched. This wasn't a system error. This wasn't a glitch. The data had been tampered with. Specific log entries, the ones I had identified as containing the most sensitive information regarding Project Chimera and Blackwood, were either missing or had been replaced with heavily redacted, sanitized versions. The timestamps on these modified files, however, indicated they had been altered before I even archived my original. Wait, that doesn't add up, I murmured aloud, staring at the screen. My own archive was supposed to be inviolable, a snapshot of the original. But if the original itself had been compromised before I even got to it, or worse, if my own archive had been infiltrated, someone wasn't just trying to close the case. They were trying to control the narrative, to erase the truth. And they were operating at a level that could bypass our most secure protocols right under my nose. This wasn't some external hack. This felt like an inside job. I looked around my lab, the familiar equipment suddenly feeling alien, potentially compromised. My own workspace, my sanctuary of truth, now felt like a glass house. They were watching. They were manipulating. No, I wasn't overthinking. I wasn't chasing ghosts. I was being actively, deliberately obstructed. The walls were closing in, not just on the case, but on me. Case concluded, evidence cleared for disposal. The words echoed in the cavernous, high-ceilinged evidence processing center, already a chaotic hum of activity, made worse by the overflow from the morgue at capacity after mass casualty event just a few blocks away. Every available space was being repurposed, every hand stretched thin. The colleague, a younger man named Marcus, shifted uncomfortably, his gaze darting past my shoulder to the stacks of new intake. Disposal, I repeated, the single word a tight knot in my throat. The CEO's case, that's impossible, we had a hold on it. The investigation isn't over. My voice was low, laced with a disbelief that bordered on anger. Marcus wrung his hands, a nervous habit I'd noticed in him before. The system flagged it UserYJ. High priority clearance. Came down from, well above, said it was a clean wrap-up. No further leads, no remaining questions. Standard procedure when a case is officially closed and the facility is under this kind of pressure. He gestured vaguely at the controlled pandemonium around us, carts laden with biohazard bags, technicians rushing past with sample trays, the distant wail of another transport arriving. We just don't have the space. Not with everything. His eyes, wide and apologetic, confirmed it. The official line was that the CEO's death was an open and shut, if tragic, affair. But my gut, that nagging, insistent little voice, knew better. It had been whispering to me ever since I'd found that anomalous data packet, the one that didn't quite fit the official narrative of a simple, targeted assassination. I took a deep breath, forcing my initial surge of frustration into a cold, hard resolve. When exactly was this clearance issued? Yesterday afternoon. Like I said, the hold was lifted. It's gone, UserYJ, already processed out. He looked genuinely sorry, but his words were a dead end. Gone just like that. The meticulously catalogued digital devices, the trace fibers, the unique pollen residue I'd flagged, all of it swept away, deemed irrelevant or worse, inconvenient. This wasn't just about space. This was deliberate. Someone wanted that evidence buried. I thanked Marcus. My voice clipped and walked away, the noise of the processing center fading into a dull roar behind me. My mind raced, sifting through every detail of the CEO's case. What did I have? What had I personally touched, analyzed, kept? My personal workstation, a small cluttered sanctuary tucked away from the main forensic lab, was where I always retreated when things got complicated. It was a mess of half-empty coffee mugs, dog-eared journals, and spare hard drives. But it was my mess. It was also where I sometimes kept unofficial copies, backup of a backup, of particularly intriguing anomalies. Call it professional paranoia, or just a deeply ingrained habit of never trusting a single source. I powered on my secondary machine, a beast-eyed custom-built for heavy-duty data recovery and decryption. My fingers flew across the keyboard, pulling up my personal log for the CEO's case. There it was, a notation about a corrupted data cluster from the CEO's primary secure comms device. The official report had marked it as unrecoverable, likely damaged during the incident, but I'd always had a hunch. I'd made a raw byte-level copy, a ghost file that didn't appear on any official manifest, and tucked it away on an encrypted drive. And then there was the physical. I rummaged through a small, locked drawer in my desk, pulling out a slim, velvet-lined box. Inside, carefully labeled, were a few glass slides. One in particular caught my eye, labeled CEO007 Trace Anomaly. It was a microscopic synthetic fiber, no bigger than a speck of dust, found embedded in the CEO's lapel. It wasn't cotton, wool, or any common blend. My initial spectral analysis had shown a complex polymer structure, incredibly durable, almost like something designed for extreme conditions. It had been dismissed as an environmental contaminant, but something about its perfectly uniform weave and unusual composition had bothered me. I'd kept a sample just in case. I inserted the encrypted drive, initiating the recovery protocol for the corrupted file. It was going to take time. While the progress bar crawled across the screen, I carefully placed the glass slide under my high-resolution digital microscope. The fiber, iridescent under the focused light, seemed to shimmer with an inner life. I began running a new battery of tests, cross-referencing its unique spectral signature against a recently updated, obscure database of advanced materials that had just gone live, a pet project of a colleague in another agency. The digital file recovery was agonizingly slow, each percentage point a testament to the file's deep corruption. I kept one eye on it, the other on the microscope's display. The database search for the fiber was yielding nothing, then a flicker, then a partial match. It wasn't a perfect hit, but it pointed to a class of materials developed for high-stress environments, specifically a rare, custom-synthesized polymer used in the construction of ultra-secure subterranean facilities. Subterranean facilities. That was a detail that suddenly felt profoundly significant. Just as the thought solidified, a chime from my computer announced the completion of the file recovery. I clicked open the restored data. It wasn't a standard log or communication file. It was a hidden partition buried deep within the comms device's firmware. Inside, a single heavily encrypted message. Decryption was another hurdle, but I had tools for that. Minutes later, the jumbled characters resolved into plain text. Project Chimera. Phase 3 initiated. Target, redacted. Location, coordinates followed by a code name, the Deep Vault. Confirmed deployment of Asset Gamma. Date 3 days before CEO's murder. Status update from the architect required. My breath hitched. Project Chimera, the Deep Vault and Asset Gamma. Asset Gamma, the name, or rather the code name, rattled something loose in my memory. That case had been officially closed, deemed an internal power struggle. The key players either disappeared or imprisoned. One of them, a brilliant but ruthless security specialist, had been identified only by the moniker Asset Gamma in leaked internal documents. He was presumed dead, having vanished during a botched extraction. But the most shocking part, the redacted target. My fingers flew, cross-referencing the coordinates with the location database. It pointed to a remote, highly restricted research facility, known only in hushed tones as the Deep Vault, a facility rumored to be protected by the very same ultra-durable polymers I just matched to the fiber on the CEO's lapel. The facility was owned by a rival tech conglomerate, one that had been in a fierce, silent battle with the CEO's company for years. The connection was undeniable, terrifying. The CEO's murder wasn't a standalone event. It was a piece of something much larger, a meticulously planned operation. Codenamed Project Chimera, reaching back years, involving a supposedly dead operative and a powerful rival corporation and the architect. That name sent a fresh wave of unease through me. It sounded like someone at the very top. The evidence wasn't gone. It had just been scattered, dismissed, buried. But I had found the threads. And now I knew something truly dangerous. The kind of truth people killed to keep hidden. The kind of truth that made you a target. I looked at the decrypted message, then at the microscopic fiber under the lens. I was in deeper than I'd ever imagined, and I was completely alone. My breath hitched. Project Chimera. My mind raced through old case files, obscure reports, even whispers from the dark web. Asset Gamma. It connected to an older investigation, a cold case from nearly a decade ago, a seemingly isolated incident that had always gnawed at me. A low-level government contractor, found dead in their apartment, officially ruled a sudden cardiac event. No foul play, case closed. but I remembered the peculiar residue on a discarded coffee cup, a microscopic crystalline structure that defied typical identification, eventually dismissed as environmental contamination. My gut had screamed otherwise. Now that gut feeling roared. Asset Gamma wasn't a person, I realized, not directly. It was the method. The crystalline residue. A delivery system for something far more insidious than a simple stimulant. If I was right, the tech CEO hadn't suffered a heart attack, not in the way the official report claimed. They had been given one. I pulled up the initial reports on the CEO's death, the ones that had been so confidently stamped natural causes with contributing factors. The rapid onset of symptoms, the specific cardiac arrhythmia, the lack of struggle, it all fit the profile, too perfectly. Perhaps the official narrative was a masterpiece of misdirection, built on a foundation of plausible deniability. No obvious trauma, no poison detectable by standard toxicology screens. Just a sudden, fatal physiological collapse. But I had found something. A near-invisible trace on the CEO's smartwatch banned a faint, almost imperceptible discoloration that I'd initially catalogued as a common environmental contaminant, a residue from a cleaning solution. Now my fingers trembled as I zoomed in on the high-resolution images. The pattern was subtle, almost fractal and disturbingly familiar. The crystalline structure. This wasn't a cleaning agent. This was Asset Gamma. The method was brilliant in its simplicity and horrifying in its precision. A contact agent, absorbed through the skin, triggering an immediate, catastrophic cardiac event that mimicked natural causes. No needles, no ingestion, just a brush of a hand. A casual lean against a treated surface, or in this case, a device worn constantly against the skin. The killer wouldn't even need to be present at the moment of death. I leaned back in my chair, the fluorescent hum of the lab, a dull drone against the frantic thrumming in my skull. This wasn't just murder. This was an assassination designed to leave no trace, to be indistinguishable from a natural ending. And it pointed to a level of sophistication that went far beyond a disgruntled employee or a rival corporation seeking market share. What were they? I started cross-referencing every keyword, every obscure mention I could find. The Deep Vault seemed to be an initiative, or perhaps a location, associated with extreme data security, beyond even top-secret government classifications. And Project Chimera. The name evoked something experimental, something cobbled together from disparate parts. A weapon, a program. The CEO, a visionary in data encryption and network architecture, wouldn't have been targeted for their money. They would have been targeted for their knowledge or for access to something they controlled. The motive wasn't simple greed. It was about power, control, the suppression of dangerous information that Project Chimera and the Deep Vault represented. The CEO must have discovered something, or was on the verge of releasing something that threatened those who held the reins of power. Something so explosive, so destabilizing, that it warranted a silent, untraceable execution. Asset Gamma was the perfect tool for such a task, leaving behind a death that everyone, even forensic analysts like me, would initially accept. If this was a deep-state operation, or something even more clandestine, then I was poking a hornet's nest with a very short stick. The initial investigation had been steered away from foul play, the official reports meticulously crafted. Anyone questioning it would be seen as a conspiracy theorist, or worse, a threat. I considered my next move. I needed confirmation of the crystalline structure, a definitive analysis that would stand up to scrutiny. I thought about sending the sample out, but then a grim thought stopped me. Who could I trust? If the conspiracy reached the highest echelons, then the very systems I relied on could be compromised. I had to be careful, meticulous, and utterly discreet. My phone buzzed. It was a colleague, their voice tight with exhaustion. UserYJ, I won't believe the chaos here. The morgue at capacity after mass casualty event. We're turning people away, bodies stacked like cordwood. If I needed anything else on my CEO case, forget about it for weeks. We're completely overwhelmed. The call, meant to convey an apology for potential delays, only solidified my resolve. The world was too busy with obvious tragedies, too distracted by the sheer volume of death, to notice the quiet, precise murder of a single tech CEO. It was the perfect cover, a backdrop of overwhelming grief and systemic strain against which a carefully orchestrated lie could flourish. No one had the resources, or the inclination to dig deeper into a death that looked so natural. Except me, I looked at the glowing screen, the magnified image of the insidious crystalline pattern. This wasn't just about solving a murder anymore. It was about exposing a truth so dangerous it had been buried for years, perhaps decades. A truth that now put a target squarely on my back. My initial doubt about the case, the nagging feeling that something was off, had been correct. I was alone in this, and the stakes had just become terrifyingly personal. The world outside my workstation was a muted cacophony of sirens and hushed, grieving voices. The air felt thick, heavy with the collective sorrow that had descended after the mass casualty event. Every screen in the lab, when not displaying data, flickered with news reports, images of devastation. Colleagues moved with a somber efficiency, their usual banter replaced by curt, professional exchanges. Even the light seemed dimmer, as if the sheer volume of death had absorbed some of the sun's energy. I, however, found myself in a strange bubble of focused intensity. The call from the chief, meant to convey an apology for potential delays, had only solidified my resolve. It was the perfect cover, a backdrop of overwhelming grief, and I was convinced that's precisely why it had been chosen. My victim, the CEO, was a whisper in a hurricane of screams, and that made his case, paradoxically, scream louder to me. I leaned closer to my primary monitor, the glow reflecting in my glasses. The victim's digital life was a sprawling, intricate web. Most people left breadcrumbs, this man had left entire bakeries, but I wasn't interested in the obvious email trails or the public social media footprint. I was looking for the shadows, the places he didn't want anyone to find. My fingers danced across the keyboard, navigating through layers of encrypted communications. He'd used a secure messaging app, one known for its robust privacy. On the surface, it looked like standard business chatter, but I dug deeper, past the content, into the metadata. Timestamps, connection points, server hops, and that's where the first flicker of unease began. The connections, while anonymized, consistently routed through a series of proxy servers, all terminating in a small cluster of IP addresses that seemed to belong to a seemingly innocuous cloud hosting provider. Nothing overtly suspicious, but the pattern was too clean, too perfect. It was like watching a master magician where the trick wasn't the illusion itself, but the meticulous absence of any visible strings. "You still on that one, UserYJ?" I looked up, blinking. A colleague, their face etched with fatigue, stood by my desk. A mug of lukewarm coffee clutched in their hand. "Everyone else is swamped with the, They gestured vaguely towards the screens displaying the casualty count. "This one needs to be solved too," I replied, my voice sharper than I intended. "It's not going to wait in line." They just nodded, a weary resignation in their eyes. "Just thought you might need a break. The atmosphere in the morgue at capacity after mass casualty event is overwhelming." They shivered slightly. "The chief is looking for more hands to help with identification there." I felt a pang of guilt but pushed it down. My work here was just as vital. "I'm close to something," I said, turning back to my screen. "This isn't just about who pulled the trigger, it's about who paid for the gun and who owned the gun shop." The colleague didn't press. They just sighed and shuffled away, leaving me to my digital hunt. I shifted my focus to the victim's financial trails. A man of his stature, a tech CEO, would have complex finances. I expected offshore accounts, shell corporations, and I found them, a labyrinth of them. But what caught my eye wasn't the size of the transactions, but the source of the funding for a particular series of shell companies. Small, almost untraceable transactions. Micropayments, really, flowing in from dozens of disparate, seemingly unrelated accounts across the globe. They were like droplets of water, each too insignificant to flag, but collectively they fed into a single, larger stream. And that stream, I discovered, flowed into a perfectly legitimate-looking holding company, Ethelred Innovations Group, Ethelred. The name didn't ring a bell immediately, but the sheer volume of capital it managed, the dizzying array of subsidiaries it controlled, was staggering. It wasn't a tech company, not directly. It was a diversified investment firm, holdings in everything from agriculture to aerospace. And buried deep within its complex corporate structure, I found something that made me freeze. The cluster of IP addresses from the secure messaging app's metadata. They weren't just hosting for Ethelred's public-facing websites. They were also the endpoint for an obscure internal VPN service used by a small, highly specialized subsidiary of Ethelred, one focused on strategic digital asset management. Corporate speak for data harvesting and influence operations. A chill snaked up my spine. This wasn't a random connection. This was a direct line, but the dots were still too far apart to draw a clear picture. I needed a unifying thread, something that tied the digital communications, the financial movements, and the very specific method of the CEO's murder together. I began cross-referencing, looking for anomalies. The burner phone activations, for instance. A pattern of new devices used for a single brief burst of activity, then discarded. All originated from a narrow geographic corridor, yet never the same cell tower. It was ghost-like, untraceable. My screen filled with a dense overlay of data points. The communication intercepts, the financial flows, the digital footprints, the geographic locations of burner phone activations. And then a tiny, almost invisible detail emerged. A cryptographic signature. Not a unique key, but a specific, custom-built hashing algorithm used in the encryption of the secure messages, in the digital authentication of the financial transfers, and even embedded in the firmware of the burner phones. It was a digital watermark, a fingerprint, and it led to one place. A single, dedicated server cluster, physically located in a repurposed underground bunker owned by Ethelred Innovations Group, but operating completely autonomously from their main network, a black box. This wasn't just a simple murder. This was a meticulously crafted operation run by a network, and the network, I now realized, was Ethelred, the puppeteer. My fingers hovered over the screen, the weight of the revelation pressing down on me. Ethelred Innovations Group wasn't just wealthy, it was a hydra, its tentacles reaching into every conceivable sector. And if they were behind the CEO's murder, then this wasn't just about a single victim. It was about control, about power. My mind raced, the sheer audacity, to orchestrate such a complex, untraceable assassination, then to hide it in plain sight amidst the chaos of a national tragedy. It was brilliant, terrifying, and utterly ruthless. The puppeteer wasn't just powerful, they were untouchable, or at least they thought they were. This wasn't just a case anymore. This was a collision course. I had just scratched the surface of something vast, something that could crush me without a second thought. This wasn't just a murder, it was a carefully pruned branch on a very old, very strong tree, and I had just started digging at the roots. The world outside was mourning the dead, but I had just stumbled upon a living, breathing monster, and it knew I was looking. The labyrinth of offshore accounts and shell corporations stretched before me like a digital spiderweb, each thread leading to another, more obscure entity. The victim, the tech CEO, had been a master of financial misdirection, but I was a master of forensic unraveling. I spent hours, days, chasing currency flows, cross-referencing names, dates, and jurisdictions. The deeper I went, the less the picture resembled a standard corporate structure and more a deliberate obfuscation. It wasn't just about tax evasion, it was about hiding something far more sinister. My office, usually a sanctuary of quiet focus, felt increasingly like a pressure cooker. The city itself was a drumbeat of urgency. News channels played a constant loop of the disaster, the grim reports of the morgue at capacity after mass casualty event. A stark reminder of how easily one man's murder, even a prominent one, could be swallowed by larger tragedies. It amplified the frantic tempo in my own head. My specific investigation, I knew, would be seen as a minor ripple in a tsunami of chaos, making it easier for powerful hands to sweep it under the rug. I zoomed in on a particular shell corporation, Aegis Solutions Holdings Limited, registered in a small island nation known for its opaque financial regulations. Its primary listed business was logistics and supply chain management, a generic enough cover. But its financial transactions, when I finally peeled back enough layers, told a different story. Large, irregular sums, not consistent with typical logistics operations, moved through its accounts. And then it hit me, a jolt that straightened my spine and sent a prickle of unease up my neck. Aegis Solutions wasn't just receiving money, it was dispersing it. And some of those disbursements, small but consistent, went to a series of seemingly unrelated accounts that, through a painstaking process of elimination and pattern recognition, I recognized as belonging to mid-level government officials, regulatory auditors, and even a few minor political figures. Not enough to raise major flags individually, but collectively. It painted a picture of systemic influence peddling. But here's where it truly snagged me. One of these accounts, linked to a regional planning official, had a transaction that coincided precisely with a major rezoning approval for a parcel of land. A parcel of land owned by another obscure entity, Viridian Enterprises, which I had traced back to a holding company directly linked to the victim's own personal wealth, not his corporate empire. Wait, that didn't add up. Why would the CEO use a shell company linked to his personal finances to pay off a planning official for a parcel of land, when his primary tech corporation had its own legal and lobbying teams? It was too convoluted, too exposed. Unless the land itself wasn't for his tech company. Unless it was for something else entirely, something he couldn't afford to have traced back to his public persona. Something that needed to be kept utterly secret. I pulled up the property records for the rezoned land. It was a sprawling, disused industrial complex on the city's outskirts, a relic from a bygone manufacturing era. Years of neglect had left it a skeletal shell of rusted girders and broken windows, perfect for hiding something or someone. My gut screamed at me. The financial trail led to this physical location. This wasn't just about money. It was about power, influence, and a secret so significant it had cost a man his life. My digital hunt was done. Now I needed boots on the ground. The idea of going there alone made my palms sweat. I was a forensic analyst, not a field operative. But who could I trust? The conspiracy I now suspected reached far too high. If I brought this to my superiors, it could be buried before I even finished the sentence. I had to secure undeniable proof, something that couldn't be spun or dismissed. Before I brought it to anyone, I gathered my gear, a robust external hard drive, my encrypted tablet, a high-resolution camera, a multi-tool, and a compact headlamp. I dressed in dark, nondescript clothing, leaving my identification at home. This wasn't an official visit. This was a reconnaissance mission born of desperation. The drive out to the old industrial district was eerily quiet, the city's usual hum muted by the ongoing crisis. Streetlights were sparse, casting long, dancing shadows. The complex loomed out of the gloom, a silhouette of decay against the bruised twilight sky. A rusted chain-link fence, partially collapsed in places, offered little resistance. I slipped through a wide gap, the metallic tang of stale air and damp concrete filling my nostrils. The main gate was secured with a heavy, modern padlock incongruous with the rest of the derelict property. Someone wanted to keep people out, or something in. My multi-tool wasn't going to cut through that. I circled the perimeter, my headlamp beam cutting through the dense weeds and broken glass. I found a smaller access door on the far side, near what looked like an old loading dock. Its hinges were rusted solid, but the frame itself was weak. A few well-placed kicks, straining muscles I didn't usually employ in my work, and the door groaned inward with a shriek of tortured metal. I stepped inside, my heart thudding against my ribs like a trapped bird. Dust motes danced in my headlamp's beam, illuminated against the vast, cavernous space. It was an abandoned factory, all right, but not entirely. There were signs of recent activity, a cleared pathway through the debris, fresh tire tracks in the dust, the faint smell of oil and solvents that hadn't entirely dissipated. My breath hitched. I wasn't alone. I moved slowly, deliberately, my senses on high alert. I navigated around defunct machinery draped in cobwebs, past stacks of rotting crates. The financial trails had pointed to this place, to something hidden. What was it? Then I saw it. Tucked away in a corner behind a stack of tarpaulin-covered objects was a small prefab office unit. Not abandoned, generator-powered maybe. I approached cautiously, my hand on the cold metal of my multi-tool ready for, I wasn't sure what. The door was locked, but a quick scan revealed a keypad entry. I didn't have a code, but I did have my expertise. A quick check of the wiring, a carefully placed bypass with a tiny wire from my kit, and the lock clicked open with a soft thud. Inside, it was surprisingly clean, starkly modern against the backdrop of ruin. A desk, a computer monitor, a single chair, and on the desk, not a computer, but a heavy-duty, reinforced strongbox. This was it. This was what they were hiding. My fingers trembled slightly as I examined the box. No external locks, just a biometric scanner. Not my fingerprints, obviously, I pulled out my tablet, connecting a specialized data cable. If this strongbox was connected to a network, even a local one, I might be able to find a backdoor. The strongbox's internal system was robust, but not impenetrable. After what felt like an eternity, a progress bar crawled across my tablet's screen. Then, a soft click from the strongbox. It sprang open. My heart leaped into my throat. This was it, physical proof. I carefully photographed the ledger's cover, then each page detailing names, dates, and what looked like coded payments. Then I began cloning the encrypted drives, a slower process but essential. As the data transferred, a sudden, sharp clang echoed from somewhere deeper in the factory. Metal on concrete. Someone else was here. I wasn't just racing against time. I was racing against them. The clang had been sharp, metallic, too close. My breath hitched, a cold knot tightening in my stomach. I didn't wait for a second sound. My fingers, still trembling from the adrenaline of the data transfer, yanked the drive free. Every instinct screamed at me to move. I scrambled from behind the rusting console, my gaze sweeping the cavernous factory floor, shadows dancing in the dim emergency lights. Nothing, but the quiet felt heavy, expectant. I felt eyes on me, though I saw no one. Was it a guard, another operative, or just the wind rattling a loose sheet of corrugated iron? I didn't know, and I didn't have time to find out. I didn't look back, just kept walking, then running, to the beat-up sedan I'd parked 2 blocks away. The engine rumbled to life, a comforting vibration against the lingering tremor in my hands. The drive home was a blur of streetlights and anxious glances in the rearview mirror. I had the data, the labyrinth of offshore accounts and shell corporations, the digital breadcrumbs leading to the highest echelons. It was all on that drive. Now I just had to make sure it saw the light of day. My apartment felt like a temporary bunker. I didn't bother with sleep. Instead, I called the seasoned investigator and the tech specialist, my 2 most trusted allies in this increasingly dangerous game. We agreed to meet at a secure, out-of-the-way warehouse across town, a place used for seized evidence that was too sensitive for official channels. They arrived before dawn, their faces grim in the warehouse's sparse lighting. The tech specialist, a quiet person with a knack for unraveling digital knots, immediately plugged my drive into their setup. Lines of code scrolled across the screen, a digital avalanche of financial malfeasance. "It's worse than we thought, UserYJ," the tech specialist murmured. Their brow furrowed. "Hundreds of layers, ghost companies in jurisdictions I've never even heard of, but it all funnels up to a single very familiar name." They tapped a specific entry, highlighting it. My gaze locked on the name. A high-ranking official, a paragon of public service, or so the headlines claimed. My suspicions had been circling them, but this was undeniable, irrefutable proof. This wasn't just about a murdered CEO anymore. It was about systemic corruption that reached into the very fabric of our society. "We need to expose them," I stated, the words firm, leaving no room for doubt. "But we need more than just financial records. They'll find a way to discredit this, to bury it under a mountain of legal jargon." The seasoned investigator, a person who had seen more than their fair share of official deceit, nodded slowly. "They'll spin it as a rogue actor or a misinterpretation of data. We need something physical, UserYJ, something they can't explain away with a press release." I thought about the smaller threads I'd been tugging at, the peripheral players in this vast network. One name kept resurfacing, a low-level courier, a known associate of the tech CEO, who had recently turned up as a casualty in a citywide mass casualty event. His death had been ruled accidental, a tragic consequence of the chaos, but something about it had always gnawed at me. Too convenient. The courier, I said, a plan beginning to form. The one who died in the mass casualty event. His body would have been sent to the morgue at capacity after mass casualty event, right? The investigator's eyes widened slightly. Amidst the chaos, yes, why? I need to see him, I have a hunch. Something small, something easily overlooked in the pandemonium. If he was carrying information, he wouldn't trust it to a phone or a laptop. Too traceable. He'd have something hidden, something analog. Navigating the morgue at capacity after mass casualty event was an experience I wouldn't soon forget. The air hung heavy with a sterile, yet deeply unsettling scent. Gurneys lined every available space, each shrouded form a stark reminder of the recent tragedy. Emergency personnel, their faces etched with exhaustion, moved with a somber efficiency. It was a place of overwhelming grief, and logistical chaos. Precisely why I thought I might find what I was looking for. No one would be paying close attention to a forensic analyst making a discreet re-examination. I managed to pull strings, using my official credentials and the excuse of a routine cross-referencing of personal effects. The attendant, overwhelmed and barely coherent, pointed me towards a section filled with the unclaimed or unconfirmed. It took me nearly an hour, navigating the labyrinth of gurneys, to find the courier. His file, hastily compiled, confirmed my suspicion: blunt force trauma consistent with debris impact. His face, even in repose, held a familiar weariness. I began my meticulous search, ignoring the bustle around me. I checked his pockets, the lining of his jacket, the soles of his shoes. A prickle of doubt began to creep in. Had I been wrong? Was this a wild goose chase, wasting precious time? The weight of the conspiracy, the danger I was in, pressed down on me. What if I was just grasping at straws, leading my allies into a deeper pit? This was it, the moment where I questioned my own judgment, my own ability to see what others missed. The stakes were too high to be wrong. Then my fingers brushed against a small, almost imperceptible lump sewn into the hem of his trousers, just above the ankle. It was tiny, no bigger than a grain of rice, but distinctly foreign. With a small, sharp knife from my kit, I carefully cut the thread. It wasn't a grain of rice. It was a micro SD card, encased in a thin layer of waterproof plastic. A wait, that doesn't add up moment. Who would sew a micro SD card into their trousers if they were just an accidental casualty? Back at the warehouse, the tech specialist carefully extracted the data from the tiny card. It was a series of encrypted messages, time-stamped and location-tagged. Personal, no digital trail. And attached to it, a photo, the high-ranking official holding a distinctive antique pocket watch. The seasoned investigator whistled softly. Blackmail. This courier wasn't just a messenger, he was a dead man walking. He was carrying the proof of the official's complicity, a fail-safe, probably meant to be delivered if he ever disappeared. And he just did, I finished, feeling a grim satisfaction mixed with a fresh wave of urgency. This is it. The physical evidence, the direct link. We use this. The plan solidified quickly. We would leak a controlled portion of the financial data to a trusted investigative journalist, enough to raise serious questions, but not the full, overwhelming picture. This would create a diversion, a smokescreen. Meanwhile, I would arrange a direct meeting with the high-ranking official, under the guise of presenting new findings from the tech CEO's murder investigation. You're walking into the lion's den. We give them enough rope to hang themselves, and then we pull the floor out from under them. The confrontation was inevitable. The exposure, long overdue. All that remained was to spring the trap. The cold metal of the burner phone felt like a promise and a threat in my palm. The partial financial data, the carefully redacted files, they were out. The investigative journalist, a contact I'd trusted with a fraction of my soul and a significant chunk of my career, confirmed receipt. Her terse, got it. Going live in 30 was all I needed. The first domino was pushed. Now, for the big one, my palms were slick. This wasn't a lab, sterile and predictable. This was the razor's edge, and I was betting everything on my calculations. Had I pushed too hard? Was this all a house of cards, built on my own desperate need for truth, or was the foundation truly as solid as the evidence I'd painstakingly assembled? A tremor, subtle but persistent, ran through me. It wasn't fear. Not exactly. More like the internal shudder of a bridge before a massive load crosses it. I chose the meeting location with a calculated grimness, the morgue at capacity after mass casualty event. It was a place of overwhelming grief and logistical chaos, a strange, grim sanctuary. The usual surveillance would be stretched thin, focused on the processing of the deceased, the identification, the endless stream of anguished relatives. No one would be looking for a clandestine meeting in a quiet, overlooked corner of its sprawling, temporary annex. The air hung heavy, thick with the scent of disinfectant and something else, a pervasive metallic tang that hinted at the grim work within. The low hum of generators was a constant drone, overlaid by the hushed, broken murmurs of conversations, the occasional muffled sob. Temporary structures, white tents stretched taut, dotted the vast concrete expanse, each one a testament to the sheer scale of the recent tragedy. Figures moved with a weary efficiency, their faces etched with a profound exhaustion. Here, amidst such raw public sorrow, my private confrontation felt like a sacrilege, yet it was precisely this anonymity, this desperate distraction that I needed. They arrived not together, but within minutes of each other. First, the director, his expensive suit a jarring contrast to the somber surroundings, his face a mask of practiced concern. He offered a curt nod, his eyes scanning the area with a habitual predatory sweep that found nothing amiss. Then the strategist, a man whose quiet demeanor belied a mind like a steel trap. He gave me a thin, unreadable smile, his gaze lingering on my face for a beat too long. They expected me to be scared, perhaps to be offering a surrender or a desperate plea. They wouldn't have agreed to meet otherwise. "Thank you for coming," I answered, my voice steady despite the flutter in my gut. I gestured to a small, isolated table placed between two large storage containers, partially shielded by a stack of empty gurneys. It wasn't exactly private, but it was out of the direct line of sight. "UserYJ," the director began, his voice smooth. "I understand you have concerns. We can discuss this in a more appropriate setting." He made a dismissive gesture, implying my current choice was in poor taste. "This setting is perfect," I countered, my gaze unwavering. "It reminds us of the fragility of life, and of what happens when powerful people decide who gets to live and who doesn't." The strategist shifted, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Let's not be melodramatic. You've been digging where you shouldn't, UserYJ. You've made some assumptions." "Assumptions?" I scoffed, a bitter laugh catching in my throat. "I deal in facts, in trace evidence, digital footprints, and the cold, hard logic of motive." I pulled a small, encrypted tablet from my bag, placing it on the table. Elias Vance's death wasn't a random hit. It wasn't even a simple assassination by a disgruntled rival, as you tried so hard to make it seem. The director leaned forward, his composure cracking slightly. "We have the official report. The investigation concluded what you wanted it to conclude." I cut him off, my voice rising just enough to carry over the low hum of the facility. But the official story never quite fit. The single, clean bullet wound, the lack of struggle, yet the scene was staged to look chaotic, a desperate struggle. That was the first wait, that doesn't add up moment for me. The lack of trace residue from the supposed struggle. The perfect exit wound with no spatter where it should have been. I tapped the tablet, bringing up a complex diagram. My analysis of the ballistic trajectory and the unique rifling marks indicated a specific type of custom-made weapon. A weapon, as it turns out, registered to a shell company in the Caymans, a company that conveniently funnels funds directly into a campaign PAC linked to you, director. I pointed at him, his jaw tightened. "Preposterous. Is it?" I zoomed in on another image, a microscopic fiber, almost invisible, found deep within Vance's wound. "This isn't a common textile. It's a rare synthetic, used in a very specific line of high-end tactical gear. Gear, I might add, that the strategist here was photographed wearing at private hunting retreat just weeks before Vance's murder." I looked at the strategist, whose thin smile had vanished, replaced by a rigid blankness. "And then there's the digital footprint," I continued, pressing my advantage. "The accidental system crash at Vance's company, obscuring crucial data. You tried to mask it as a simple server overload, but the unique signature of the remote access attempt, routed through a series of ghost servers, led me right back to a private network. A network that, through a convoluted series of dummy corporations, ultimately connects to an offshore data farm you both secretly control." I spun the tablet around, displaying a damning financial spreadsheet. Elias Vance was about to expose a massive fraudulent scheme, a network of illicit investments siphoning billions through your shell companies. "Director, leveraging your political influence. He threatened to go public, so you silenced him. You hired the strategist to orchestrate the murder, making it look like a messy, opportunistic crime. Then used your influence to steer the official investigation away from the truth." A low growl rumbled in the director's chest. "You have no idea what you're meddling with, UserYJ." "Oh, I think I do," I responded, a grim satisfaction building in me as I saw the fear finally dawn in their eyes. "I'm meddling with justice." Suddenly, the strategist moved, fast. His hand shot out, not for the tablet, but for my throat. I reacted on instinct, shoving the table between us, sending the tablet skittering across the concrete. A sharp, piercing sound cut through the air, not a scream, but a distinct, high-pitched ping from my burner phone, which had just received an alert. Almost simultaneously, a flurry of hurried footsteps sounded nearby. A harried-looking official, his face pale and stressed, rushed towards us, clutching his own phone. "Director, the news, they've just broken a story. Massive financial fraud. Your name is all over it. And the strategist is implicated." The director froze, his eyes wide with a sudden horror. The strategist's hand, which had been reaching for me again, faltered. The journalist had delivered. The distraction wasn't a distraction at all. It was the anvil, dropping just as I struck the hammer. In the ensuing chaos, with the official shouting into his phone and the director's face draining of color, a figure emerged from behind one of the temporary tents. It was the detective, looking tired but resolute. A couple of uniformed officers right behind him. He hadn't been far, he'd been waiting. My meeting wasn't as private as they thought. "Director, strategist," the detective said, his voice cutting through the rising tension, "I believe we have some questions for you regarding the murder of Elias Vance. And now, these new allegations." The director looked from me to the detective, then to the strategist, a defeated rage burning in his eyes. The strategist, ever pragmatic, merely sighed, his shoulders slumping. Justice, it seemed, was beginning to be served, but the cost. I watched as they were led away, the director still muttering threats under his breath, the strategist impassive. I felt a profound weariness settle into my bones, deeper than any physical exhaustion. Exposing such power left scars and made new enemies. The world was a little safer, yes, but I was now standing in a harsh, unforgiving spotlight, and the fallout was only just beginning. The air in the sterile hallway still hummed with a strange, charged energy after they were led away. I watched the director, his face a mask of bitter defeat, and the strategist, whose usual cool composure had finally cracked into a weary slump, disappear around the corner. The sound of their footsteps, accompanied by the firm, measured tread of the officers, faded into the silence. Justice indeed was beginning to be served. But the cost, that word echoed in my mind, a heavy, persistent thrum. My shoulders, which I hadn't realized were hunched so tightly, finally relaxed, letting out a breath I'd been holding for what felt like months. The detective stood beside me, his gaze following the same empty corridor. He didn't say anything, just offered a slight nod, a silent acknowledgement of the battle won, and perhaps the battles yet to come. The relief was immense, a wave that threatened to buckle my knees, yet it was laced with a strange, unsettling emptiness. The chase was over. The puzzle was solved. Now what? The official statements came quickly, a carefully orchestrated cascade designed to contain the fallout. The initial reports were vague, citing irregularities and unethical practices within the highest levels. Then, as the evidence I'd meticulously compiled became undeniable, the narrative shifted. Systemic corruption, betrayal of public trust. The truth, in its raw, unvarnished form, began to seep into the public consciousness, a slow-acting poison to the carefully constructed facades of power. My name, UserYJ, was mentioned, then expanded upon, then highlighted as the linchpin in uncovering the conspiracy. It felt surreal, like reading about a character in a book rather than my own life. The days that followed were a blur of debriefings, testimonies, and the relentless flash of cameras I tried my best to avoid. Each interview, each retelling of the evidence, was a fresh excavation of the nightmare I'd lived. I found myself recounting details I wished I could forget, the subtle nuances of the digital footprints, the almost imperceptible trace elements on the victim's clothing, the chilling precision of the orchestration. Every time I spoke, I saw the faces of the victims, not just the CEO, but the others whose lives were collateral damage in this grand scheme. One afternoon, a week after the arrests, I found myself standing in a long, dim corridor, the air thick with the metallic scent of disinfectant and something else, something heavier, more profound. I was at the morgue at capacity after mass casualty event. It was a grim necessity, the result of a separate, unrelated tragedy that had overwhelmed the city's resources. But for me, it felt like the only place I could go to truly grasp the scale of what had happened, to connect with the silent witnesses of the conspiracy. The attendant, a quiet individual with tired eyes, merely nodded as I presented my identification. "Just reflecting," I mumbled, though I knew he understood. He led me through a maze of temporary partitions, past refrigerated units stacked high, each containing a life abruptly ended. The sheer volume was staggering, a stark reminder of the fragility of existence. It was a somber, almost sacred space, and the quiet reverence of the workers there was palpable. I wasn't here for new evidence, not anymore. I was here to feel the weight of it all, to understand the true cost. I stopped at a particular unit, not the CEO's, but one that contained another victim, a low-level data technician whose name had barely registered in the initial reports. This wasn't just about a powerful CEO, it was about the nameless, the overlooked, the ones whose lives were deemed expendable. It was about all of them. The detective found me there, leaning against a cool metal wall, my gaze fixed on the unit. We had shared so much over the past month: suspicion, frustration, the occasional burst of triumph. Now it was a shared burden. "It's not over, is it?" I finally asked, my voice barely a whisper in the cavernous space. He sighed, a sound heavy with experience. "The immediate threat, yes. The legal battles, the public outrage, that's all just beginning. But the kind of power that built this, it doesn't just evaporate, it shifts." He was right. We had dismantled one arm of a hydra, but the beast itself still lurked. This wasn't a neat, clean victory, but a hard-won skirmish in a much larger, ongoing war. The thought was sobering, a stark contrast to the initial euphoria of the arrests. My journey through this case had reshaped me. The meticulous analyst who once saw data in black and white now understood the vast, treacherous gray areas where human greed and ambition thrived. I'd learned to trust my instincts, to push past the official narratives, and to follow the smallest, most insignificant speck of evidence wherever it led. There were moments, many of them, when I doubted myself, when the enormity of what I was uncovering felt too vast, too dangerous. Moments when the threats, both veiled and overt, made me question if I should simply walk away, pretend I hadn't seen anything. But each time, the faces of the victims, the quiet plea for justice, pulled me back. The triumph of truth was undeniable, a beacon cutting through the fog of deception, but it came at a personal toll. Sleep was still a luxury, often interrupted by replays of crucial moments, flashes of the evidence, or the imagined eyes of those who wished I had failed. My world, once neatly compartmentalized into evidence and analysis, now felt permeable. The lines between my professional duty and personal safety blurred. My future, once a clear path of progressive forensic work, now felt like a crossroads. Could I go back to analyzing routine cases, knowing the depths of depravity I'd witnessed? The thought was unsettling, yet also strangely invigorating. I had proven to myself, and to a world that often preferred convenient lies, that even the smallest truth could shatter the most formidable conspiracy. Leaving the morgue at capacity after mass casualty event, the cool, crisp air of the outside felt like a jolt. The city lights twinkled indifferently, oblivious to the quiet drama that unfolded beneath its surface. I was changed, yes. More wary, perhaps a little more cynical, but also resolute. The fight for truth was a lonely, often thankless path, fraught with danger. But as I walked away, the weight of the past weeks settling into a grim determination, I knew, with a certainty that resonated deep within me, that it was a path I was now irrevocably committed to walking. The new normal wasn't quiet, it was vigilant.